Hey guys, welcome to this new class for art103. So today I'm going to be talking about the scale and how to bring scale in an image and different techniques to do that from the repetition to the details and the reference. So that's a very important things to do, and I deliberately put the image that we're going to talk about today in that way. Sorry, so you don't necessarily see in the first place the scale of the image, so we can kind of play and try to guess what would be to bring the scale, the sense of scale in an image, which basically means understanding how big things are. You have different ways to do that, and it comes from the size of the small details that you're gonna bring into the image, or the amount of details that you're gonna bring in an image, and the creation of reference, understandable reference that visually you can assess the scale and the size. So, for example, if you look at this image here, in the first corner, obviously we have like the facade of a building, and you can very understandably see the windows. So we all know pretty much the size of a window, especially in a building. And if I go lower, I can see some cars. And already there is something strange here because the cars obviously are way too big compared to the size of these windows. So there is something strange in this image, scaling wise, straight away. Now, if I just take the whole image and I reveal you what that is, actually, that's even stranger because now you have humans, so you know the size of these people. So obviously, you've got a lot of different scales in one single image. So at the end, you're gonna pick the one that you know the most, which is probably gonna be the humans here because they are us, and you can assess the size of the building and the size now of the car. So even if you have elements that are not matching, now you're like, right, that's probably a few people just, being in the middle of a miniature city or something like that, like Toy City. So, but that is really interesting because apart from this, Ref, if you were not looking at these people here and the cars, then automatically your brain would assess the size of this building by just looking at the size of the windows, and you know the size of a window, you know the size of different floors, so you can assess how tall the buildings would be in that sort of situation or that sort of thing. So repetition of details that you understand, that is the height of a story, a floor. So it's going to be roughly 4-5 meters between each, so you can assess the size of it. A car, you know that a car is going to be roughly between 3 and 5 meters, depending on the type of the car, maybe more sometime for these very long ones. And the human is going to be between, I don't know, 160 and 180 roughly as an average. So you can assess that scale as well. So details and importance to understand the scale of things to assess how big an image is. Let's take another one. If we take this image is also really interesting because more than just giving you an idea of scale, it really tries to get you in the idea that you are really high. So how to do that? Here, it's using a different sort of technique. It's using a bit more the perspectives first, and again, as we've said last time in the last class, how you're gonna guide your eyes from the, in this case, the top to the bottom, and give you the impression that you really fall that way because it's really really high. So to do that, first of all, as usual, looking down here, the cat is looking that way as well. So basically, our characters are looking in that, which is obviously the bottom part of the city. Perspective wise, obviously we've got the lines going in that direction. So sorry for this one. The vanishing point would be very, very, very low. It would not be here. If they had been here, actually, that would probably have not been so powerful. But because the vanishing point is going to be very, very low below the picture, it gives you even more the impression of falling. A lot of geometry information here with other lines, like this direction of lines that you have here. All of these lines there are quite nice and are working with these lines here and these lines here. So it also gives you lots of, you're not just gonna looking in that way, you also create a lot of dynamic because you have very strong angles between your lines. So you have a lot of dynamic in this image and very few curves if you look at it. So curves is also quite interesting in this image because the only thing that is going to be curved actually is going to be the wings here, but you also have a lot of straight lines, but mainly curves here. The cage here for a bird, so the idea of a bird. The man himself has a very curved pose if you look at it. So all the curves in this image are related to the idea of the bird, and obviously the guy wants to jump and fly. So that's quite interesting because they kind of broke. This image has been done by Schwittens, who is a Belgian comic book artist. So all the lines which are not so straight are actually related to the idea of flying. So geometry give the sense of you are really high in the city. The haze that you have here and the fact that you're losing the windows as a reference is also an indication of how high you are. You can see how the reduction of the size of the windows is operating, becoming smaller and smaller, and they make sure that you actually see that, so you can assess how quickly this is disappearing into the bottom part of the city. So obviously you are really, really high. And now with these curves here and the look at the man in the bottom part of the city, obviously we're expecting him to jump. So we are almost falling. And even to accentuate that, you have some kind of arrows here pointing into the direction of the bottom part of the city. So it's really like an indicator of the guy really wants to jump. Everything is here to explain you that story. And by just adding these repetitions and understandable diminution of the scale of these balconies and the windows here, then you completely understand, and the use of the haze here, you completely understand how high in the city you are at the moment. So the rest is almost irrelevant. Like everything which is happening here, you don't really see it. The dog itself, you don't really see him. And the rest is kind of empty. So we're not really relying on details here. It's not details, it's more the repetition and the story itself, with the curves indicating everything related to the bird flying, so the jump. So that's it for this image. This one from the same artist is also quite interesting for the same reasons. You have here the idea of how tall these buildings are, obviously. So we had to create the illusion of very, very high, tall skyscraper. And to do that, there is a nice use of the repetition and the diminution of the windows. So, you really have these strong perspective lines going very high up and outside of the frame as in the previous one. So that's quite interesting to have this vanishing point outside of the frame, because at least you cannot see it, so you cannot really assess how far it's going to be precisely, and it just make it looking even more big. The lights here, which is breaking the direction of the perspective lines, or these lines here, are quite interesting as well, because they kind of, as in the previous one, creates a dynamic by having very hard angles on lines. So that's also something which is nice. This image has a very geometrical potential, and it feels very dynamic because you have line fighting together. So obviously a lot of lines are going up, and you really are going towards the sky here. And you have this element there which is in contradiction, and then you have a few lines here and here and here to mark the other side of the perspective, or here, obviously. So by bringing this bridge, so you're just going to create another vanishing point for these lines here, which is going to be also outside of the frame, but it's going to bring something quite interesting in the picture. The use of the light, as I was saying just earlier, is also interesting because actually it's completely fake. So these lines for the lights is not referring to anything, because obviously if you look at the sky and the highlights on the clouds here, you can imagine that the sun is going to be behind somewhere lower, a low sun somewhere in the back here. So how would you have this sort of line of light here, this beam of light? It's just not possible. But obviously, as we were talking about like cinema and that sort of thing, that can be because they want to mimic the idea of the projector or something. But in any case, these lines here are not related to any sort of perspective or indication of scale or distance or whatever. So it's just purely to put these two characters in the focus and making sure that we are looking at them. So now they are here in the bottom section, which is lower than if we were doing the rule of third. We would have been somewhere around here. So the main point would have been this one, this one, this one, and this one. And obviously they are lower, they are in outside of this. So that's quite also revealing, because it means that we really want to free up some space to represent these buildings here. So hence why this building feels really tall and really big, because they are framed in a way that make them look really tall. The vanishing point is outside. You clearly see the repetition of the windows and the diminution of their size. And you have a lot of dynamic in the image created by the addition of these other lines and perspectives lines. So very interesting image here, I think. Last one from this artist, this one, which start to use different sort of tricks here. Obviously, this is an album called Paris, or Revoir Paris. So this is the Eiffel Tower. Everyone knows the Eiffel Tower, and everyone obviously knows that there is no such big buildings around. So for those who don't know, this is what we call l'Esplanade du Trocadéro, in front of the Eiffel Tower like this. You have actually these buildings here, and you have this sort of big place where people are just walking or do some roller skating. So obviously now here in these buildings that you have behind, we're not even sure they are buildings, but clearly they have the shape here of buildings. There is no detail at all. Like, you don't even need to put any detail. You have reflections, really strange reflection actually, because reflection of trees. Like, how do you, what would you have these sort of trees here? So it's a bit conceptual, but the feeling in this image is that these buildings are really, really tall, and you don't have any detail at all in here. So how does that work? Why do you suddenly think that they are really tall? Well, it's just because you know the size of the Eiffel Tower, and you even have people here. So because you know the size of the Eiffel Tower and you know the size of people, you understand that the Eiffel Tower is way further in the picture than these people here. That obviously there is a lot of space between this and the Eiffel Tower, a lot of gap, which is the case in France between this and that. And then if you understand that this Eiffel Tower is actually really far in the background, that means that these buildings are even further behind, so even taller than what you feel. So everything is indicating that these buildings are huge and massive, and this is just by using a few tricks. The perspective lines here that all focus on this point here, centered position, low in the picture, so lots of space at the top. The understanding of the scale of the Eiffel Tower, that by reference and contrast make this building look really, really tall as well, because suddenly you understand how tall they are compared to the Eiffel Tower. So we're not exactly in the same, like we don't have repetition of windows, for example, on this image, or repetition of any elements that you know the scale. It's just that you are understanding the scale of this building by putting them together, alongside some other elements that you know how big they are. So the Eiffel Tower, you know how big the Eiffel Tower is, so you can understand the size of the building. So that's for the architecture type of thing. Let's have a few looks at other things. For example, if you take this image from the Lord of the Ring, the Helm Deep, well, this image for me is actually relatively difficult to understand. How big is that? We don't really know from this image here. You know what I mean? Like, we have the understanding of the people here. Obviously, the orcs attacking. You have a few fires, but again, you cannot really assess the size of this fire, and you certainly can't assess how tall this here is, or how tall this wall here is. And actually, in the movie, a bit later, when you're gonna see the attack, you're gonna discover that these are really tall. So why do we have this issue? We're not capable of understanding the scale of that because we are missing some details. We are missing something that we're gonna recognize as being like the size of an opening, a door, a window, or a flag, or something that we know the size of. So it's a very confusing image because obviously you cannot even read completely the orcs there, but as they're orcs, you're not even sure how tall they are exactly, but they're roughly human size. But then you kind of lose them here, so you're not sure about how distant this is. And then you don't have anything to guide you really, so you have a bit of a gap here. And then here you don't have any ref, and you can't really read anyone being posted on this line here, and you don't have any windows or any opening in here that makes you suddenly understand how big this place is or how small this place is. So that is the main reason I want to talk about this, because when you do matte painting, or when you do any sort of image, even if this is like by scattering some 3D elements, 3D assets in an environment to create like a big environment, you want to make sure that we're going to understand the scale. We're going to understand where we are and how big everything is. So if you take Blade Runner, so that is Blade Runner, the first one. Here, we need to make sure that even if you're using miniatures, we're going to understand how big the city is. So is that completely working on this image? I'm not sure. We are working with, miniatures, so, we have limitation. But the idea behind this is to have put a lot of small lines so we can basically understand that every small line that you see is a window, and therefore understanding the size of the building by the size of the windows. So if you have so many windows on the facade of a building, because we know roughly the size of the window, and we can assess that if you have different lines, it means different floors, then usually, yes, it becomes huge, because it means that we have a lot of different floors in these buildings, and especially the one in the back here becomes like gigantic ones. So that's what we try to do in this image, obviously, to try to bring details to understand the scale. But the problem here in this one is that we don't really see and understand enough the reference. Like, yes, all right, we have dots of lights, but that could also be the case of having like one window doing that and having a shutter on the window and just see through it. So maybe the floor is that size, and in that case the building suddenly becomes way smaller. If a human is this size, it's not the same as if it's just like one small dot here. So how to make sure that we're gonna understand that is really by working of the amount of details that you place in your image. And obviously you need more references than that. So if I take this other image from Blade Runner 2049, this time, like the new one, this is the same principle, right? So we also want to express the idea that the environment is huge. The only difference here is that carefully we've put some elements that we really can identify this time. So if I look inside here, you've got some small lights that you actually can understand. You've got some buildings here that you know the scale of. You know the size of the floor here. You know the size of an antenna. So you place some antenna. You know roughly the size of the signs that you have alongside some buildings. So a lot of small details here and there that you actually can understand the scale of. So references, references, references. It's all about making sure that you're going to spread enough, scatter enough of details, but also that you'll be able to understand the size of the details. Because if you don't understand the size of the details, it's pointless. You actually cannot get the idea of what you're doing. Same here, you see so that's a bit more like the negative type of thing, like you understand the scale of that sort of things because of how much detail you have on them, just because you see them on contrast with the light which is behind. So that is quite clever and it's really nice work. Here you can pretty much understand the size of a car if you were here. So that gives you an idea of the size of the whole city. What I'm saying is not just working on architecture. I know I've been talking a lot about architecture, but it works also on materials like this. What is it? Obviously, this is a facade of a building, but what size is that? It's concrete. It's not repetition because it's just the material itself, the texture itself. You cannot assess the scale of the texture in this image. And to do that, I need to reveal details that you can understand. In that case, people. So by now revealing these people there, you can understand how big this texture is, because basically you have the ref. You know that this guy here is probably doing like 1 meter and 70 or something, and that gives you straight away the size of these blocks of concrete. And because you understand the size of this block of concrete, suddenly you understand the size of this pattern, this texture that you have on it. So again, without this information, without the people around here, you would not have been able to really assess correctly the size of this element. So when you paint something, it's really important that you do that sort of things, because sometimes you're going to use an element which is not going to give enough information on the scale. So you will have to add a few details, a few artifacts, not everywhere. You don't need to put a lot of them. You just need to make sure that you've got enough so you can understand the scale. And when you have to do that, just make sure that you're going to paint just a few additional details, but understandable details, like something that people are going to recognize straight away and be like, oh yeah, good, all right, if that is the size of that thing, then I can assess now correctly the size of the whole building or the whole asset or the whole environment. Let's take a look at this plane. That's the plane of Star Wars Episode 1, the Naboo ship, King's ship, or something like that. You don't have a lot of details here. You just have a few windows. How big is that? Don't know. Look at this rock here. Does that give me an idea? If this is the sort of rock that you have in the desert in the Nevada, that this is a huge ship, But actually, you don't understand enough. You don't have enough details. So now, how can I have the information of how big that is? Well, if suddenly I put the ramp here and I put a guy like that, you see straight away with just three brush strokes, this is now becoming way smaller. And now I'm like, oh yeah, the guy would actually be like this in the cockpit. Or maybe actually the reality would be that if I was drawing the ramp, would be like that, and the people would be like that, and I would have a few here, and in the cockpit they would be like that. And now you have a total different size for this ship, because suddenly these people are becoming the reference and give me the information on how big this ship is. So we are missing details in this image to understand how big that is. We don't even have any reference outside. If we had like just a flower here, or a horse, or something that we know the size, yeah, that's my horse. You could assess how big this ship is, but without that, with none of this information, you're stuck. You have no idea of how big this element is. So that is really important to consider that. That works also for pure natural things. Like if I look at this image here, how big are these rocks? How big is that? Is that like a whole cliff of a big mountain? Is that a huge mountain? If I had to draw someone in the picture, it could totally be that sort of scale. That would totally work in here because, or even smaller, because you can see this sort of formation, in the desert, where that's actually the size of it and the scale of it. But that's not the case in this image, because if I reveal that, suddenly if I move a bit, I see the size of someone here. And oh wow, that is actually way smaller than what I was anticipating, because now I have the reference of this guy jumping around, so I can assess how big that is. So now my small man here looks ridiculously small, because that's not viable with the rest of the image. Without this ref, that would work. So again, having a reference in the image and enough small details to give you this reference is the way for you to understand how big things are. A last couple, desert. Desert is another example where you're going to have some trouble. Sorry, that's this one. Because it's really difficult to assess anything. If you look at this image, how can you say how big that is? You can't, because you don't have any details at all. So if you're working on an image, if you're working on a matte painting, for example, for a desert, or if you need to scatter or create like an environment, a 3D environment of desert, you're going to have to give more reference than that. So this is why you're going to have to add a few trees if you have like the possibility, like cactus or that sort of things, or bushes, or any sort of thing that you can know the scale of. Obviously here we have like footsteps, so you can assess a little bit something, but again, it's not like massively recognizable, so I cannot really say how big this mountain is. And if I have someone, if my someone would be like that, number one, which is totally possible, or if he would be like that, number two, which again is totally plausible. So that is a main concern. So you have to bring some elements. It can be a rock, it can be like a small stone, it can be anything, but you have to give a ref to understand things. And that is what the details are meant to do. So that is one very important step. And then you can really create the impression of something being huge and very, very, how to say that, rich in terms of details and contrast. So I'm going to finish with this image, which I think is a brilliant example of that, because so the bottom part is not that important, because in the film Star Wars, I think it's episode 1, this one, you would be covered, or maybe 2, you would have like some ships and stuff that you would be animated in front of that, so that's why it's relatively empty. But if you look at the rest of the city here, like you can really tell how big and how immense everything is, especially the size of this castle, because if you look only at the castle on its own and you forget everything around, you're like, not sure about the scale of everything here. Is that like just a palace? Is that like a massive castle? Like, it's a bit difficult to say. But because this castle is put right next to some other elements that you understand, then suddenly it becomes massive, because you have enough ref. You have enough ref to understand how big these are. You have trees, so you know the size of trees. You have roads. You've got other buildings. You have vehicles. You almost see people. So a lot of details everywhere, and a good mixture of 3D and 2D, because you have a lot of matte painting for that, like with the trees and stuff. So that brings the realism up. But at least in 3D, we use the 3D tool to scatter a lot of elements and small assets that we understand the scale of. And the light is also quite interesting, because reveals a few details, reveals here the landscape. So again, you can assess this sort of landscape and vista, because you are used to see that sort of thing. So you can assess that with this sort of haze, with this sort of shapes of the mountains and this sort of details, that you can assess how big and far away this view is, how open this view is. And because you know how big now this view is, you can say, oh wow, actually this, if I look at this whole picture, this is massive, this is a huge castle, because it takes that much space, where this is already something that I assess as being really big. Also, the details of the water here gives me a sense of scale. So sense of scale for the castle. So everything is really pointing in the direction of setting this scene as being a huge scene. And that works really well because of the use of a lot of details, a lot of small elements and recognizable elements everywhere. Even the clouds are relatively well done, constructed with a nice perspective coming from the foreground to the background, and then you lose them in the distant background. So that's it. Huge castle here, very tiny small houses there, but you know the size of a house, so automatically you understand how big everything is. So that's how you're gonna do that. Details and understanding of the scale of these details is what you need to remember from that class, because that's what you're going to have to do either in 3D by placing the right amount of elements at the right scale in the right position, or in your DMP by painting additional elements if needed anywhere you're going to need them, so you can really understand how big what you are trying to show is. Obviously, if the point is to make it looking really big, so you can really take something which is relatively flat, and just by reducing the size of the details on it, you're going to start to look really big. So that's quite interesting technique. And of course, the repetition of small elements that you know, like window, antennas, that sort of things, to also guide you through the perspectives lines to make you understand how tall something is, how far away something here is, or how deep something is. So that's it, guys. Hope you enjoyed. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a message on the forum, and I'd be very happy to talk to you. And again, if you have the opportunity to try to test everything I'm telling you in these classes by just going outside and take your pictures of your photo or your phone, of something to illustrate what we've just talked about, that would be amazing, because that's probably the best way for you to learn and really understand what I'm trying to explain. It's really by going practical and take your camera out and just try to create an image with a lot of perspective, create an image with a lot of depth, create an image with a lot of small details and a huge amount of scale, that sort of thing, or for the color harmony. So that's it. I'll see you soon in another one, and see you soon. Bye-bye.